Welcome to Writer Syndrome, podcast about writing from start to finish. This episode's topic, genre expectations. I'm Russ Capasso, and joining me as always is Tim Letney. So genre expectations. What are you expecting in this episode?
I didn't expect us to both be wearing hats today.
Yeah, hatting it up.
I think it's, important, to have your genre in mind when you're writing, I guess. How about you? What are you expecting today, Russ?
I'm expecting from this episode.
Yeah, from my performance on this episode. Are you expecting me to be underprepared?
Yeah, actually. So if we're talking genre expectations, if we're talking about people expectations, the genre of Tim would be shooting from the hip, unprepared. And then when I say, "Don't worry, man, I've got some stuff," you'd be like, "Oh, okay." Good.
Yeah, I prepared a little bit. I got some bullets I'm going to talk about today.
Can't wait. So genre expectations, I agree. I think it's one of those things that, and for me in particular, it took me a little bit to kind of nail it down. And then I ended up doing like some backfilling research. It's like, you think you know a thriller genre, you think you know a particular genre because you watch these movies and read these books. But
maybe just to explain a little bit what we're talking about for those that don't, just the idea that the genre that you're reading or writing has this kind of pre-existing expectation of what's going to happen inside those pages, right?
Yes. Yep.
So like you pick up the book and already the audience has this idea of what they're going to get because they've gotten it a million times before. Yep. And the idea is whether you follow those or iterate upon them or subvert, which I think is maybe a bad idea. But
save for the very, very experienced. And even then, I don't even think a lot of the very experienced authors still stick within their genre, right?
Yeah.
That's something else we can talk about. But and I mean, even taking a step further back too, like understanding your genre also helps, that initial introduction to the reader, the book cover, like book cover design, right? Like
title, right?
You wouldn't pick up a book with like a dragon on the front of it and think, is this going to be a romance novel? Maybe it will. I don't know. Maybe there's some dragon love out there. I don't know. But there's expectations. You see a cover and you're like, okay, I know this is going to be fantasy. I know this is going to be a romance. I know this is going to be a thriller. And even coming down to the description too, that's found the book cover blurb on the back, and even what you find on Amazon, like even out those teaser descriptions, they're still going to fall within. You're going to read it and it's going to fall within the genre you're expecting to get, or set a tone in your mind.
Yeah.
You're like,
I think the title's a great example of that too. Look at something like Gerald's Game, some short story by Stephen King.
Yeah.
And they turned it into a movie, which is actually a pretty good movie. And it's a cool short, but man, that title does not, you don't know what you're going to get.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think titling is super important and also kind of tricky, I guess. How about your title, Russ? Like when you came across, were you like, okay, this is firmly, because yours could honestly and has been, right, a horror title.
Oh yeah, which was a little bit of a concern. Well, not really a concern because that's much more popular. I won't get there, but
and your genre, not horror. Your genre is sci-fi espionage.
I'm so kind of fun to think about that, but mine would probably fall more into techno thriller, and I kind of want to talk more about like what that means. And
where would your book be if you walked into like a bookstore?
Probably in like the thriller section.
So it wouldn't be in sci-fi?
Probably not.
So in thriller.
Yeah, I think so. And again, like the original premise, I was like, oh, this has got more of like a sci-fi feel to it. And I was like, oh, maybe this is science fiction. I was like, nah, actually,
but you know what?
90% of the book is not, and it's more of a thriller. It's more of like almost like an espionage thriller.
If you put it in science fiction, you would be setting up the wrong expectation for the reader.
Yes, 100%. Whereas I think if I put in a thriller, like the little bit of sci-fi that is in it would be acceptable. As I dug more into the subgenres of thriller, techno thriller kind of stood out, which I was aware of. I knew I've read other books that kind of fall in that category, and it's very kind of encompassing of, can be encompassing of like science fiction elements. So it's like, okay, this is probably where my book lies. So it would probably sit in the thriller category. And once you read the synopsis, description, and whatnot, you see the cover, I think it kind of all falls in that group. So hopefully, yeah, that was part of even beta reader testing when I had some cover art concepts ahead of time and using that as like a what do you expect this book to be about? And for the most part, it seemed like it did pretty good of landing those expectations based on just the cover design. So
yeah, mine, I don't know. I feel like I'm very firmly in the horror genre,
Yeah.
where I do have like some, I guess there's science fiction elements. There's like some kind of eco horror or maybe biological, like because there is some, aspects that relate to science, I guess, but it's still
Yeah.
firmly horror.
Yeah.
Um, Harder for me is that when I began writing this, I wanted it to fall somewhere between honestly young adult, like YA fiction,
Hmm.
and horror. And YA, it's its whole genre,
Yeah.
really,
Yeah.
right? All of a sudden, like you're lumping in fantasy and science fiction and like kind of horror and all of it's just YA.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but I didn't want to write in YA, but I wanted to have that breezy, fast-paced nature that it
Hmm.
has with the weight of horror. Because honestly, to me, when I think back to being a teenager, it's kind of what it felt like. Things
Yeah.
were fast, but the stakes were high.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
was like, how do I get there? How do I do like Percy Jackson meets The Stand? But now, and honestly, I probably could have edited my book in a certain way to make it a YA novel.
Yeah. And I mean, we talked about that too, because you've talked about this like a long time ago too, where you were kind of on the fence of like leaning towards making it more like YA, but you also wanted to lean into like the more horror elements and kind of those
Those
gruesome
expectations,
scream.
right? I like,
Yeah.
and that's the stuff that and it's probably because when I was a teen or even preteen, I was watching horror.
Yeah.
So I have those expectations of the scenes being kind of gross
Yeah.
and there being tension
Yeah.
and there being some kind of swears and things like that. Also, I feel like it's true to the age group that I'm writing about because
Yeah.
they're not, some of them are like late teens and some are in their 20s. So,
Yeah.
but yeah,
It's
so that was my only hesitation, I think. It's like, oh, should this be YA? And then as I was writing, I was like, no.
no.
I mean, I'd have to edit myself so much. It'd be like a made for TV movie in the 80s, right?
Feel like a Hallmark horror movie. And it's kind of interesting too. The expectations. I was just found like a blog post from a random author online. They're a cozy mystery author, which is
like like a fireside mystery.
yeah, and there's it's a very specific subgenre of mystery where, whatever the crime or whatever happens is always resolved by the end. Everything's buttoned up nice. There's expectation of no swearing in the story, stuff like this. And it was interesting to read this blog post from this author who was like, yeah, I had put out a book or two that, had these elements that people weren't expecting. And people wrote to me saying like, yeah, I don't like this because it has these elements. I was expecting this. And I was like,
what's the author's name, just so we can give him props?
Yeah, Elizabeth Spann Craig.
Okay,
she's a best-selling cozy mystery author and has.
I mean, would you think that like 40s, like 30s and 40s crime fiction is that? Like, there's no swears, everything's buttoned up at the end. Now it's horribly misogynistic,
right?
like your Chandlers and
some of those genre expectations need to change.
That actually, I had that as one of my prepared bullets. Is that some genre expectations need to evolve and change?
Yes.
But it does feel like those are kind of, minus the rampant misogyny.
Yeah.
And sexism, those are kind of PG for the time stories.
Yeah.
Although maybe not, right? Because like the idea, at least gun violence at the time was probably really taboo. Whereas now we're like, oh, pish posh gun violence. How quaint. What is it, a Tuesday afternoon?
Yeah. Whatever.
But yeah, back then. So maybe it was a little more risque then. But interesting. So the mysteries, I wonder what she's writing about. I wonder if it's like murder mysteries or if it's just like who stole something.
Yeah, I think they're mostly like murder mystery type things, but there's always and another aspect of it too I thought was interesting is very specific, but we'll dive into some of the other genres as well. But was no killing of pets or animals in this genre. This like
I like that.
Yeah, I mean, and there's some expected, but then you go up a level. Like it was like no killing of kids and animals in this type, right? So people are expecting because like they don't want to read that. Like these books and for some people are an escape from that type of shit that's happening in the real world. So they want to read something that's not happening. But you go up to like a thriller of some sort, and that can be that's completely different. Like the expectations are different. Like particular horror, I'm sure there's
I mean, I'll talk about the animals thing, especially in like horror movies.
Yeah,
there is an expectation, at least there was in the 80s, of like animal harm, which I've always hated.
Yeah,
and it never added to the story in any way. It just seemed cruel.
Do you think it was there to make you feel uncomfortable though, on purpose?
Yeah, I think it was to be like,
But not
I don't know,
shocking. But not like shocking, like to be the sake of shocking. But
it's
to
usually
like,
the first thing that like gets it before the human characters start kind of getting it.
yeah,
Whereas the kids are often left alone in those slasher type movies. But yeah, I think it ups the tension and the uncomfortability, but I just don't know what it adds. In a way, it's
yeah.
just like if you're making me turn my head, if I'm turning my head away from the screen or the book, I don't know. That's one I wouldn't mind moving away from. Not,
Yeah.
although I harm so many animals.
I was just gonna say, was
Yeah, but the ethos of mine is like pro animal and
it's
like, you know,
but that's touching in your theme. So I mean, going back to what we are just saying, like you're doing something for the sake of doing it, just to like kind of exploit it and be
I'm like,
over
I can't
the
believe
top.
that they
like,
would hurt a dog, and I'm taking out farms,
I was gonna say, like,
corporate farms of animals. But that's a commentary against corporate farms. So,
yes, no, but it's fitting in your theme though, and that's the point of it.
which is
It's
like
not-
the
it's not
eco
just for-
terror aspect of, I guess, or
Yes.
eco horror aspect of, I guess, my subgenre.
Yes, you're not doing it to
It's
exploit
not
those
malicious.
cows. You're not exploiting those cows, just by slaughtering them. Someone else is. You're doing it as a statement about what they're doing.
Yeah, yeah.
Coming all back to it, it's kind of what we started with. It's like knowing your genre before getting into it. I wish I had put a little more thought to it in the beginning, because it might have helped me frame how like the elements that are good that were going to go in there and how the ending was going to go. Because I think in the beginning I had all these ideas floating in here. I'm like, this is like two different types of books. Like, what am I doing? So tightening that up kind of helped me shape it, but hopefully we'll set the stage because my next book is definitely going to be more science fiction. It's going to be kind of like a crime science fiction.
Interesting. And are you
Yes.
comfortable jumping genres like that?
From
Like your thriller? Because now you're going to be in, say, like, just in theory, I guess. I mean, well, no matter what, you're going to be listed in two different
this
like
becomes
spots on Amazon.
this becomes like a USA Today best-selling novel.
But even if it's not that, like say like on Amazon, this is very possible, right? Where it's like, you know, the top 30, you know, best-selling new books or something. But they do sub things. They'll be like
Yeah.
thriller. They'll do like horror, you know, they'll do science fiction. So
Yeah.
no matter what, if you'll be tagging your book in two separate ways, your books and your name will be separated. Like you're breaking the ecosystem.
I don't know, like, because I again, it's a great question too, and something I'll be digging into more soon is like the Amazon categorization, because they do have like X number of categories you can tag your book in and like a bunch of subcategories. So like,
Do you think you could do both, maybe to cross list?
yeah, like
Because
I mean,
it's also it's in universe, isn't it?
yeah, yep.
Interesting.
For this first one, I'd probably tag it as like thriller, probably science fiction. Like I'd have to tag it as like thriller, science fiction, and then do like techno thriller, like a subgenre, and then whatever else there is in there. And then for the second book, it'd probably be thriller, crime thriller, science fiction. Probably still fall under techno thriller too.
Interesting. Then, like, if you do tag back to what we mentioned before, if you do like do one of the tags as science fiction for your current book,
Yeah.
and I buy that book, and I don't get the genre expectations,
Yeah. Is that going
am I
to,
going to leave you a negative review or something? Like, is that going to hinder future sales?
maybe I leave the science fiction out and I just stick with the techno thriller, because people who are reading techno thrillers are going to be expecting, they may be expecting science fiction based on what they read. So if they
I
read
do
techno
think that you
thrillers-
walk a line of science fiction. I think I mean, honestly, after I'd finished your book, I wasn't like, oh, like it felt, I don't know. I think you walk a line between those genres pretty well.
Well, thank you. Hopefully the readers will think the same. 5-star reviews, please. Yeah, but again, coming back, like I think knowing the genre that you're looking at, and even the subgenres too, looking into those. If you're going to write a thriller, understanding like the genres that are there will help you how to, like, the things you're expected to include in your story. But again, coming back to like cover design, book description, everything else, it really kind of helps you with like a guiding light of like, okay, these are things that are expected. I need to fall within this group, because it is important,
Russ, can I ask you a quick question about your book? So you're a planner. I don't know. That's been well established.
Yep.
Did you begin with like a list of expectations in mind, or did you kind of just keep that in the subconscious level? Like, oh, there needs to be a chase, or there needs to be like, surveillance and spycraft or whatever else.
You know what? No, actually,
Yeah, you're a pantser.
no. But what I did was I knew all the elements that I wanted in the story because it was something that I wanted to read.
Mhm.
It's something
Oh,
that
yeah.
I enjoy reading, and basically what it ended up doing was pretty much outlining all the key points for a thriller.
Yeah,
It's like
that
there's
makes a lot of sense.
there's like a race against the clock. There's definitely some action chase scenes. There's the techno side of like hacking and doing these those sorts of elements. There's a little bit of like it's not very procedural. I don't get too hardcore in that, but there's a little bit of that, and like
Mhm.
all these moments of things and little espionage and that sort of thing all these things that I like and I want to read.
So you got that from researching comps then, right? Like you knew going in, like you'd probably had read a plethora of books coming in and you're like,
Yeah.
oh, like, so it was almost second nature. Like you
I
knew
think-
that you were in.
Yeah, and I think it's just something we've even brought this up before. I mean, there's once you've watched and read a certain number of books and watched a certain number of shows and movies, obviously you gravitate towards a certain things that you enjoy, right? I enjoy the thrillers, I enjoy the espionage, I enjoy science fiction. You start, I think, just naturally picking up some of the things that are there, right?
Yeah.
Even if you're not really paying attention to it, again, because those are genre expectations. Those are the things that, as a reader, just a casual reader or watcher of these things, you just know are there. And,
Yeah.
and you start expecting them. So as the writer of those things, I was like, oh, these are the things I definitely want in there because that's what I enjoy. So
Yeah, I think that's an important point, right? Like and worth reiterating, you're writing the book you'd want to read.
yes.
So it's delivering on all the things that you yourself as like the ideal audience member would get. And if you didn't get them, then your expectations wouldn't be met. You'd be disappointed.
Yeah. I mean, at some points, I definitely don't want to read my book anymore because I'm fucking sick of it.
Well, now.
but now I'm back in love with it. I love it again. So
He's back.
I definitely worked a little bit backwards with it. I
had
had an idea. I had an idea, roughly idea when I'm piecing things together and I go back and I was like, oh, let me think of the movies that I really enjoy that I kind of want to put this, like make this feel like Sneakers. I love that movie. 3 Days of the Condor, like these older kind of espionage movies mixed with something, a little bit newer thriller. That a little more fast pace. That was kind of like my initial like blocking for it. So
Yeah. I like the idea. I mean, I like how much movies influence novels. Even going back to like Stephen King,
Mhm.
when he started with the Dark Tower stuff, he was so influenced by like spaghetti westerns and seeing them in the theater and how big everything was, like that kind of camera eye or mind's eye.
Yeah.
And not only did it come through his early books, it still comes through. There's still that kind of Western vibe to it.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, he was super influenced by Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
And that stuff's in there too, that kind of questing. Yeah, it's just interesting. I mean, for my own piece, it was a mixture of like expectations of a novel and expectations of a horror movie. And there's times when I brought my
Yeah.
characters to horrific situations and, I paused for a moment, like how gory do I want this? And how gory does the audience want it? Because there's this expectation of sometimes the camera pulls away in a horror movie, and there's the whole like, usually it's for budget, but critics will say, oh, they pull away and your mind's eye can picture things that are so much more horrible than what they can film.
Yeah.
But dealing with like writing as an art form, they have to picture it. There's no image. So, and you're almost forcing the reader to picture something really uncomfortable. And I just didn't know how far I wanted to go into it. And sometimes I tried to be like, not mean with the gore, but like there's certainly kind of a plethora of it. And other times I think I leaned kind of slapsticky, like Evil Dead 2-y or something with it, because
I could see
I also didn't want it to be mean or not, that there's no joy or because there's some ridiculousness.
There are some
moment.
there's some moments. I'm thinking one in particular that I don't know. I don't want to say because I don't want to spoil anything, but there's certain moments that it's kind of like you put some humor in there, and it's like I'm not taking this too seriously. And I think it's good because it's also moments of like, because there's moments in your book where I was like, this is just dreadful, and there's one scene in particular in a tunnel.
So
I was
good.
like,
so good to hear.
I feel so claustrophobic in this moment. I was like, just get through the tunnel. And then there's moments of like where you kind of lighten it up, and it's like, okay, this is still a pretty dreadful moment, but there's just as a bit of humor. I think that kind of places really well to kind of pull things down a bit. So it brings you back down while it's still kind of a horrific moment, and then like another scene or two later, it kind of pulls you back into like the serious dread, which is like, I think it's a good pacing because
I mean, and those are always my expectations of like, I like that move from seriousness to levity to seriousness again,
Yeah.
as opposed to just feeling like I need a shower after, like we talked about. Well, you said that about Last of Us 2. It's such a wonderful video game, right?
Oh,
But oh my God, you just want to go clean yourself after that horrible, like,
oh my
there's
God.
almost no levity at all.
It's such a great game and it's great story, but I was like,
And there's
okay.
movies like that too. Like I was just started rewatching some of the Halloween movies, and those Rob Zombie ones,
Yeah.
there's no joy or humor in them. They're just mean, right?
Yeah.
And they're very intense, and that's what he wanted. But my expectation is some levity. Like I like a little bit of levity in my horror, and I hope, and I'm glad, at least according to you, that it comes through a little bit in what I wrote, because I don't know, I want people to have fun in addition to be uncomfortable.
Do you feel like any of that levity it just comes from the moment of the time that we're kind of in right now, where everything feels kind of dreadful? You're like, I don't want to reflect that entirely, or is
I don't
that,
know. You've been
that
to
too
movies
much?
with me when like something ridiculous happens on the screen, and I'm like the only one laughing in the
Yeah.
audience, and you're like, oh my
There-
God.
I mean, I remember there's one moment you and I were both laughing in Midsummer. Oh my God, when the guy jumps off and there's one guy with a giant hammer over his shoulder. And I remember we literally looked at each other and were just like, really? Like, I wonder what's going to happen next. Like there was,
And that's not because it's humorous, but like it was unexpected, I guess. I mean, well, I guess that's expected, but I often laugh when things are unexpected because it makes me happy to see something I haven't seen on the screen before.
Yeah, but
which
that
is
was also like
super rare.
That was also like a cartoon, though. He's like,
Yeah.
here's the giant bunny with a giant hammer. I'm like, well, I wonder what that's gonna do.
Yeah. Yep.
But that movie's pretty dreadful.
Another mean movie.
So I don't know, like, we could touch on some like the broader genres and kind of the expectations you get from them.
Yeah, that's great.
So I mean, this is kind of like the more like the popular genres that are out there, right? So it's like, fantasy, obviously, science fiction, romance, adventure, mystery, horror, thriller, historical fiction. Like those are like the big categories, right? The overarching ones, and everything kind of falls under those in some shape or form. I'm sure I'm missing some other ones, but so like, fantasy, you're going to expect like some creatures and magic, system of some sort, right?
Yep.
I just picked up the Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne, which I've been told is fantastic. And you get the cover, and it's like there's a giant dragon and this little guy with a sword and a shield. I'm like,
And
fantasy.
you're like, oh, this must be romance.
Yeah, this must be Japanese romance. Got it. That Tim was talking about. And yeah, there's expectations like heroes, villains. You get a lot of good versus evil, Lord of the Rings, type of stuff.
And we should be clear, right, that this is like iterative on top of the beats, right? They all have the beats. Everybody's
Yes.
on their character journey, their arc, their quest, or whatever.
Yeah, and I think you'll find like within fantasy and with all these like adventure fantasy, more often than not you'll get more like the hero's journey type of beats, right? Where they're kind of pretty specific, found in everything. Pretty much. I mean, those beats can definitely cut across all the genres, but I think with each of these, there is another expectation of the types of characters that are going to be in there, right? The types of setting as well, and
it's probably okay in these types of in fantasy, right, to broadcast it, right? Because I think that's almost an expectation, right? Because there's this idea of fate, or like obviously, for every book ever, your main character should be the only one who can go through this journey. But I think you kind of want to, for other genres, maybe not bury it, but you don't want it to be so telegraphed that they're on a heroic quest.
Yeah.
There's not a spotlight on the journey. There's a journey, but I think it's okay in fantasy to kind of have that spotlight because, you're rooting for that character to go through this. And like their quest itself is like, a metaphor for their own self-actualization.
Same thing, science fiction, obviously there's an expectation of like this world building, I think, that falls probably fantasy and science fiction really, right? Like I found that kind of interesting when writing a techno thriller pretty much takes place now, maybe in a year from now. The world building is different. Fantasy and science fiction, you spend so much time on that because it's important and it's also expected, right? You're expected that. I mean, at the beginning of this book, like open it up and there's a giant map of some made up Viking land. I'm like, cool.
And
you
probably get like family lineages and, like deep history of like kingdoms and like, those are genre expectations. What an interesting thing to write. I can't even imagine it. Like this whole history of your own realm.
Yeah.
Whereas science fiction, right? You're probably
technology.
Yep. And like oddly enough with like Dune, right? Like they do, it's oddly fantasy mixed because they do like the lineage and the houses and all that stuff. But then
Yeah.
also on top of that, there's the technology and
Yep.
like the space travel and the economy. I feel like
Yeah.
science fiction is big on economy,
Yep.
whereas fantasy is more lineage and maybe mythical creatures or something.
Yeah, I mean, and time obviously plays a part in both of those pretty heavily, right? Like
Yeah.
when they're taking place. Obviously, like with fantasy stuff, there's always this medieval kind of vibe to it. I mean,
Yeah.
science fiction, obviously, you're wherever hundreds of years in the future or something. So
And right, there's this kind of like techno fetish with some science fiction where it's like the new hot technology that you put into your eye or a cool new kind of vehicle or space travel or whatever
yeah,
else. There's some kind of like design and architecture around it
yep.
that's yeah, really interesting.
And there's also like, I mean, I've had conversations with a lot of people about science fiction. And in particular, a friend of mine she's very into making like hard science fiction. And for the most part, a lot of science fiction, she's like, that's not science fiction. That's fantasy. It's fantasy.
Really?
I did have a great conversation with someone when I kind of blew their mind when I was like, I told them Star Wars was fantasy. And I was like, I mean, this is a pretty known thing. And they're like, really? Why do you think that? And I was like, it literally opens with once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away. Like that's a fairy tale.
Yeah.
I mean, and everyone's already, Lucas has said it's just a fantasy, right? But those are expectations. Like a lot of people think that's science fiction, and that's fine. And there's an expectation that falls within that. But yeah, I think a lot of those have kind of some crossover elements to it. And then coming back to like, then you go into like romance and adventure. Same thing. Adventure's got like, we'll have like that hero's journey. Always a quest of some sort. Like I could think of like adventure. I mean, that's Lord of the Rings, I guess. That's a mix of adventure and fantasy. Even Ready Player One's probably like that science fiction adventure. So you get some crossover, but you're not really jumping out too far from like the key elements that you expect there.
I'm still kind of digesting what you said about Star Wars. I feel like we could dedicate a whole episode to arguing about that. But
yeah,
but I agree. It's interesting to think about though. I wonder if one of the reasons why it's become so timeless, right, is that it is, let me just say, I mean, it's got a science fiction world at least
yep,
with a fantasy overlay of the story of the journey, which is a very simple, kind of aiming for the middle. Like everybody can understand this journey. I wonder, I mean, that's probably the trick of writing something that is really easily accessible to all people. And then you walk the line of it almost being timeless because it's easy for everybody to understand. It's almost like writing a pop song. Like you want it to be as easy to follow as possible. And science fiction often is not easy to follow. When I'm reading it, it's hard to picture it. Like I love Asimov, love him.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's really hard to picture like the conveyor belt that throws you down the street.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Really interesting. Anyway,
I think you're right. I think that's a great point to bring out too. Is like, since it leans more on being fantasy, like there's no technology that pins it to like are we going to have laser swords? I don't know. Maybe. Do we need them? No. Like there's no, and like they have swords. They're basically swords. Like it's fantasy. Like it's kind of interesting to see like.
So then Dune's probably like the novel is probably high fantasy, right?
Yeah.
Even though it's in a science fiction world. They lost that rock, paper, scissors. Star Wars, swords, Dune, shields. Shields are not cool.
No.
I guess they've got the vibro swords, but even those aren't really cool. Interesting. Okay.
I mean, I think you've got an expectation when you see that stuff on screen.
But I mean, I definitely try to have, and it's not fantasy, but I'd say my hero's journey is hopefully not too telegraphed, but it feels like I don't want to say reductive, but it's integral, right? And it's, in a way, it's very easy to follow, I think.
Yeah.
And I guess that's for better and worse. I mean, I would never say that my book's a fantasy book, but it has those easy to follow characters and motivations. At least I'm trying to have it not be complicated in that way. Complicated world, but easy story, I guess.
I think that also comes back to, knowing the genre and like what the expectations of the characters within that world too, right? I don't know, for like horror, it's kind of interesting because like you've, I guess horror
tropes.
Yeah, I was just thinking like you have Final Girl, right? Like, but you've got there's a lot of tropes that kind of live within the horror. I mean, I'm trying to think of like, I'm sure there are horror where it's like there is like a hero's journey thing going on, and I guess maybe you could apply it loosely to some stories with some characters. I don't read enough horror to know. But
Yeah, I mean, I think when people think about horror tropes, they're mostly thinking about movies.
yeah,
I mean, they definitely exist
the stupid
in
kids in the
in books.
basement, right?
Yeah, dumb kids. I mean, and I think there's a difference between trope and genre expectation. I'd say like a trope is like the car's dead, and I feel like the expectation is your boyfriend's dead. You know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
so there needs to the trope is just like the excuse to I don't know, hinder the characters in some way. And it always feels so ham-fisted in the movies. I think it's less so in in books. But
yeah,
there are those expectations. One that and I think we're slowly getting away from it. And we've talked about it before, but one that kind of crosses the divide between film and novel is this kind of objectification of women.
yeah,
And that I wouldn't even say is a trope. I would say it's a historic genre expectation of horror. And it's one that I disagree with, and it's one that I want to move away from and not do.
yeah,
Um, so it's weird, and I think a lot of authors are moving away from it. Like I'm no by no means the first author to move away from it, but as you're writing a book, you know, and you get to a scene, it's like, oh, do I want to describe this right now? Is the audience expecting me to describe a shower scene or something, or
yeah, yeah,
a romance scene? Something scintillating because that often is part of horror novels. These scintillating scenes that are meant to like titillate, and
yeah.
that's not the subgenre of horror that I want to get into at all. It has no interest to me, and it's I don't know. It just feels reductive and like it
Yeah.
has no place. But it's there. It's super present. It's present in a bunch of books I have on my shelf, and I'd say almost all the movies I own.
Yeah.
And so it's a very active choice to move away from that.
I don't think I have any problem with if I were to read a science fiction novel, because I mean, if you start blending in genres correctly, there is no major surprise. But I guess that kind of helps. Like maybe if you write a thriller, it's got some science fiction in it. It's always going to be kind of stated pretty early that there is science fiction involved in it, so
Mm-hmm.
it won't be a surprise if all of a sudden they're like, we can do this thing because we have this technology. You know, it's like,
There's something that both you and I wrestled with in different ways, and it's totally a genre expectation. It might just be a art form expectation. The idea of romance. I mean, even like away from physical scenes, but the idea of
yeah,
like characters falling in love through this arc,
yep,
and like I know we wrestled with it
yes,
and tried to iterate away from it. I failed to some extent because it kept
yeah,
creeping its head. But I think that's an expectation not only of readers, but an expectation of editors, an
yep.
expectation of publishers that that they want to please that demographic who finds love through this arc, through this story, even if it's not even related to the main story.
I have a feeling if I were to go and query and went through the whole traditional publish route and had someone actually, yeah, we'll do your book and then bring it to an editor and agent and all that sort of stuff. I know on top of my head they would absolutely say these two characters you got to have you need to have this be a little more of a
So then, what
no
are
thank
you?
you.
Why? I guess I want to lean into that a little bit. If you know it's going to be a suggestion, and is there a distrust that like some of your audience will love it and some will hate it, or just it's not? Do you not enjoy it when it happens in books? I guess if you're writing the book for you, the audience, and an audience like you,
I don't
do you roll
enjoy.
your eyes when that happens, or you're like, "Yay, they got together"?
I do roll my eyes because most times it feels like it's shoehorned in because it feels like it's a note from an editor or from someone from the publishing house saying like you have to have some type of romantic connection here, and it always feels so shoehorned in, and it's just like
Yeah,
it's like the James Bond thing. It's like the even the Jack Reacher stuff. It's like there's always like a love interest of the week type of thing,
yeah.
and it feels just so like this just feels shoehorned in, like they're in the middle of this crazy situation, and you know what we need to do right now. And it's like I don't want to do that with my characters. Like, and
What about other genres? I feel like we touched on a few. Is there other genre expectations for what do we
yeah,
have left?
I mean, we covered quite a bit there, but yeah, I mean, romance is pretty straightforward. Is typically happy ending, star-crossed lovers type of love triangle. You know, there's gonna be more internal struggle, which, yeah, and romance also, as we said, that kind of falls in a lot of secondary plots in every other genre. So Adventure we kind of talked about. Mystery, another big one.
Interesting, just that the idea of romance is I've never read a romance book.
Me neither. But it's like the number one genre.
Yeah. And it's interesting that the thing that we're trying to avoid through ours is like the core, right?
Yes.
You'd think the core, like the relationship pull, is integral to that. But kind of like, I guess, like having not read romance, but knowing like peripheral, like that you've got your Twilight, and even though it's horror kind of in YA, it's romance, right? It's like kid romance, or like 50 Shades of Grey. It's like all about the relationship. I wonder if then is plot itself secondary? Everything must be in service of the romance. I would take it for the romance book for that to deliver on.
Yeah, because I think in those, like, I've watched movies and seen plenty of Nicholas Sparks movies now.
Really?
Yeah, for the other podcast, watching terrible movies.
Hey,
I've watched
Russ,
a couple.
What's your other podcast name?
Thanks for asking, Tim. It's This Meets That. It's a podcast where we watch the shittiest movies from trailer to end credits, scene by scene, and give a full breakdown of.
Well, that sounds really interesting.
Thanks, man.
Where can I find that podcast?
You can find it on all major podcasts, Spotify, Apple, Google.
Oh, nice.
It's thismeetsthat.com. Yeah, go ahead on over there. Check it out.
So now you're a Nicholas Sparks expert.
Yeah, but so I haven't read any of his books, but watching two of those movies, which are clearly right in the romance, category. It's like, yeah, there is no the plot. The plot is the romance. That is it, right? Which, okay, that's fine. That's there's certain types of readers who love that stuff, or viewers who want to see that,
Yeah.
And that's completely fine. It falls within genre expectations. Watching as a movie, though, I was like, this movie is melting my brain right now. Nothing is happening. But it's a different expectation, right? Like I'm not going to go seek these movies.
And it's funny how that romance expectation traverses genres, right?
Yes.
Like, and there's others that do it too. I think horror often traverses genres. It dips its toes into sci-fi. If you look at like, Leviathan Wakes and stuff like that, you look at those Corey novels, there's a lot of horror in there. There's literal zombies in there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, especially even the first book.
Same thing with like Game of Thrones. We got like high fantasy, right? There's a ton of horror in Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But I think it's the idea of you're sticking with your core. I think you said this earlier, sticking with the core elements of the genre you're in, right? Like, and then just kind of grabbing bits from other genres and pulling them in there, and not going over the top, because then all of a sudden you have this problem. You have like two major genres kind of colliding with each other,
and then you don't know where to put it or how to tag it, right?
Yeah, or you're setting up those expectations right off the bat. Long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Okay, this is a fantasy. This is all.
That's a sci-fi. That's sci-fi.
Well, I will battle to the ends of the earth for that one. So and then you get mystery, which is there's always a crime, of course. There's detective or sleuth or something. There's always clues and red herrings. So those are. But
now you're in mystery, a little bit. Your book. Or no.
Mine's definitely thriller, because like now you look at the thriller, there are some crossovers here. Like thrillers, you're going to expect like a Race Against the Clock, which I've got, Quick Pace, which I think I've got. There's gonna be some red herrings, obstacles, threats, and stuff like that, which I definitely have. And like
so then maybe it's just like we said before, it's got elements of mystery, but it's not core to the story.
Yeah.
So then what's unique about mystery?
Because you think about like mystery, I think it's what's unique is it's more focused on like the crime that's occurred, right? There's some crime that's happened. Like I'm reading a thriller now. The thriller genre is really interesting because it definitely bleeds across a lot, right? Because you can have a thriller, you can have a crime thriller, you can have a psychological thriller, which are lean more towards horror aspects, right?
Yeah, which I guess that's like your Silence of the Lambs and stuff.
Yeah. There's like the subgenres for thrillers. I mean, you've got, the serial killer stuff like Red Dragon. There's just so many. Espionage thriller, which now you're in like Born Identity. So it's like, you start crossing a lot. I think the thriller is
a big genre.
It really is.
Because honestly, I guess like Red Dragon, mentally I would put that in horror, but I guess not.
I mean, it's it's more like a serial killer crime, right?
Yeah, interesting.
Which is I think that's when you start blending some of those genres a bit. It's just funny you thought of that as horror, and I thought of it as like a crime thriller.
Yep.
Just the acts of what they do is horrific, right?
Right. But also they focus, at least in Red Dragon. It's been years since I've read it, but
yeah,
they focus on the killer a lot. And
yes, yeah. And I mean, you have someone on his tail, right? You have someone trying to track him down, so it's got more of like this crime thriller kind of aspect to it.
Yeah,
it's kind of interesting. So yeah, I think the thriller category is kind of a fun one.
Oh, now I want to write a thriller.
Yeah, well, you got to write a Western horror with me first. So, which I wanted to bring that up is like now thinking about that, like we are planning on putting together like a Western horror, right?
Yep.
And there's already some expectations just by saying those two things. We've set some heavy genre expectations, right?
Yeah, I think those are easy to deliver on, though. I mean, Western's got to be pretty easy. You got yourself a horse,
a hat, and a 6-shooter. The thriller one is kind of pretty encompassing, and that covers pretty much like all the major the popular genres and some of the kind of key things that are attached to them. So, and I guess there's historical fiction too, right? Mm-hmm. Real world in the past, get historical events, conflict aligns with a time period. Obviously, there's the language that's spoken is, you're expecting it to be fitting of that time period. Kind of a mix of real and made up events, which is kind of...
Yeah, I took a class on that. It was called, in my undergrad, it was called creative nonfiction. And what a confusing genre.
Yeah, I mean, my concern of like, I don't know. So coming back to genre expectations, like, and concerns actually, and we kind of touched them already, but like I was concerned because labeling as a techno thriller, there is an expectation of this technical details, which I touch into, but I don't want to go too crazy. Like I've read Tom Clancy stuff and I've read newer techno thrillers and I don't want to go the route of Tom Clancy. Like I don't want to do that.
Too detailed.
Yeah. It's just like, 900 pages. I'm like, you don't need 900 pages to tell a story. Like, holy smokes. But a chapter spent talking about boat parts or like,
I think for a certain like subset of the audience, I mean, I'm guessing Clancy's core audience, they probably pour over that stuff.
Absolutely.
Like I was reading to my kids last night, I was reading Lord of the Rings. And it's like 7, no, I'm exaggerating, but it's like 3 pages of like landscape description. My kids always fall asleep and they go, "What happened last night in the plot?" And I'm like, "Nothing. They walked down a hill and around a bend and it was described beautifully. And I loved it, but I can see why you fell asleep."
Yeah.
So you're not going into boat parts.
Yeah, no, and I don't want to get that far into it. I still kind of want to keep the pacing moving. For me, that slows things down too much. And I've read a couple newer techno thrillers that are lean more towards like that cyberpunky vibe, which I think I feel like a lot of newer stuff will fall in that like cyberpunk futuristic, techno thrillers.
Yeah,
it's like, well, I'm not there. It's current day. This is more. But I think I've hit all the other points. There's like. Some of the other key elements like real world parallels, which I think I've definitely hit. I mean, this is
it keeps coming up in the news.
Pretty realistic. It's pretty timely. I think mine's going to be one of those like, it comes out and it's very timely and then it's going to kind of go away because in 10 years from now, that will not be, the science fiction-y part will be probably no longer exist. But also making sure it's like a global scale. That's kind of like another aspect of the techno thrillers, which I definitely have. So hoping I blended the science fiction. I don't want it to feel like, haha, got you, reader.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be very cautious of that, but I'm hoping the elements I'm dropping throughout will hint at what.
Yeah, what an interesting line to walk between delivering on expectations, yet still being surprising. Like, right, you don't want to telegraph everything, and you don't want. I mean, I think it's one of the reasons why, like, some books and many TV shows and movies are so boring because it's like, you kind of know what's going to happen. So if you've got the beats and then you've got your genre expectations, throw in a romance. Ugh, there's nothing. What are you going to do? Like, what am I?
That's it.
There's nothing to solve, man.
No.
But then in the same respect, I'd say subvert those expectations at your own risk, because you can really upset your audience if you promise one thing and then deliver on another. And like, maybe you're the smartest guy in the room or smartest girl in the room, smartest person in the room, but nobody's enjoying your book.
Yeah.
Like, and at the end of the day, like, maybe you want to write for yourself and that's cool. But if you want to write for the largest audience possible, subverting expectations can shoot you in the foot and limit your audience pretty quickly, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're kind of wrapping up here, but is there any, I'm trying to think of like some of the books I've read on writing and everything that not many get too deep into genre. Some are just like, do the research on your genre, understand the things that are necessary there, and then come back and kind of see how that weaves into like the story beats that we've talked about before, right? And I don't think I was gonna say blame the cat. It's not blame the cat.
Blame that cat, but
hang the cat. What is it? Don't hang the cat. No, there's no save the cat. You don't get. I mean, they touch on a little bit of genre, but more of I think towards the ends of examples of story types.
Yeah, honestly, I skimmed all those parts.
Yeah, there's one book I haven't checked out yet. I keep seeing it pop up. It's called like Story Grid, and it's like kind of giving you like, again, it's another like beats and structural kind of guide.
Yep.
But I'm like flipping through their website and like they get into kind of genre conventions, which I think is kind of interesting because they talk about like specific things like things that are expected from like horror, action, even Western stories, and also equating the type of story to maybe what the characters are going to be going through. You know, like Western, Eastern like stories require fundamental conflict between the individual and society. You know, like those deeper themed things that are expected. So I think that's kind of interesting. This one, it dives into pretty detailed.
Can you give me a cliff notes of what they said about horror? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, so like levels of conflict underneath that, like horror, it's got stories must mask the power of the monster throughout the story until the monster's massive power advantage is revealed. That's I guess kind of.
Hey, I did that.
You did do that.
Well, I do think that some of it, yeah, I think if you know what genre you're writing in, or at least that you're influenced by, a lot of this stuff, like you were saying when you were writing, you've digested it so much, like that it's going to become second nature, I think, in a way.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
reading
I
within your
didn't
genre.
plan for that to happen, but I mean, that's pretty much happens in every genre piece of art that I've seen for horror.
I don't know. So is there anything else you want to touch on? I feel like we crushed a lot here.
Yeah, no, I mean, my takeaways are, I think what I said before, that just make sure you know what genre you're in if you don't want to just write for yourself, and, you know, keep those expectations in mind as you're writing. And, you know, if you don't find them in the first draft, you can find them in the edit.
Yeah.
I certainly found some additional scenes as I went through where I could kind of pull out a little more what I thought I as a reader would expect or want to see.
Yeah. And then knowing it up front, I think helps. Again, I had like a general idea and I was like, I know the kind of thing I'm heading for. I didn't quite put a label on it until later. But it also helps you pull comps together and also helps you like read and watch within that genre. So you can start seeing some of the expectations that are there and also just pull some ideas. Like I went back and rewatched like War Games. That was like one of the movies like that kind of I want that vibe. I like that vibe. Ready Player One, like it's not that heavy sci-fi, but like that feel, that adventure flow. And kind of diving into other thrillers. Like I said, I read a couple Tom Clancy novels. I'm done reading Tom Clancy novels, but I was like, I need to read the things that
you got to know
came before to understand where maybe I don't want to go, which I think is helpful too, is watching and consuming as much within your genre. So you can say like, I like this, I don't like that. Make sure I don't do that.
I did the same thing with like Barker and Kuntz and King. And then more recently, like Tremblay and Cutter and Hey, I guess just do your research.
But I don't know. Is there anything you're reading or watching right now that you think has kind of fallen into? I know we talked about it in the beginning, like Andor. We both started. I just started watching now. I'm like, I've watched 3 episodes now, and that is talk about. I think it's weird. The expectations, obviously, we keep coming back to Star Wars because whatever, it's consuming everything. There's expectations, I think, that are much different now for what Star Wars should be, and I think Andor is
for a certain subset of the audience. I think this is aimed at an older audience that's like a little miffed with, Boba Fett riding a Rancor.
Oh, fucking Christ. Don't ever say that to me ever again.
But still, that's like to go buy a toy, buy a Rancor, but you're not going to sell any toys of Andor, right?
No.
You might sell some of the ships for the model builders or those who like collect Legos and stuff. Yeah. But no kid's going to be like, I want the Andor playset.
Yeah.
This is when he lost his family.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because it's a espionage thriller almost, right?
Yeah, and it's certainly not fantasy, right? Even though like Star Wars built maybe on top of a fantasy world, Andor is not a fantasy story.
No, not at all. And that's great. I think that's. I'm loving it. I think it's fantastic because there's also no connection really to. I mean, there's gonna be, but it's its own thing, which is kind of living there. So
yeah, I mean, as far as like what I'm reading now, I've really been I'm just going slowly through Peter Straub's Ghost Story, and it almost like, I don't know, it feels like a slow read, not in a bad way.
Yeah.
It takes place, I think, in the late 70s, and I think the same time it was written. It feels like out of time to me. It almost feels like a Victorian novel.
Yeah.
It's odd, but it's very good.
Mm-hmm.
Minus like some of the depictions of women. It still kind of has that old school man's eye thing, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But no, otherwise, I'm trying to think what I have on deck.
Yeah, I'm just finishing a book called Daylight by David Baldacci, who someone suggests I should read because it's kind of I think of a crime thriller, FBI procedural type of book. It's 400 pages, but I feel like I've been cruising through it. Like it's a very easy read. It's funny because, you know, preparing for this, I was thinking about all the genre expectations, and this hits every single one of them like it's a beat, you know?
Yep.
And it's like, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I was expecting when I saw the cover and read the description. I was like, okay, I know what to expect out of this book.
The one thing that, speaking of subverting expectations, so if we're jumping into like something I've seen recently that's in genre, I just watched Halloween Ends. I am a big, you know, horror fan.
Different podcast.
I mean, I think it's a cautionary tale of trying to subvert expectations while also pleasing audiences and then failing at both.
That's a tough line.
So I liked it a lot, right? Like they tried something new. I don't know why you'd want to try something new in like the concluding chapter of your trilogy.
Yeah.
I don't know why you wouldn't want to like completely deliver on like a satisfying conclusion. So they just tried something new, and Joseph Gordon-Green, like, I'm brave for doing it. It's great that Blumhouse supported it, but in the end, man, it's like another cautionary tale of subvert those expectations at your own risk, because the chatter around it forever is going to be a disappointing chatter.
Yep.
And I'll be in the minority of like, well, I like that they tried something new, and I'd rather be surprised, and like, what a risky move.
Yeah.
But not everybody likes risky moves, and it certainly was not satisfying. Like,
not with their treasured childhood, Tim. Don't touch my childhood.
I know. I mean, make that movie again for the 100th time.
100th time, yeah.
And then I've got something called a book by Michael McDowell called The Elementals on Deck that a friend of mine just recommended. And she had said that she loved it. She loved the writing style. I know nothing about it, so maybe by next podcast I can share if I ever get through Peter Straub's Ghost Story.
Get it done.
Yeah, I'll get there. All right, man.
Yeah, this is great. This is that's good. So that's our episode. So thank you everyone for listening. We appreciate it. If you enjoyed the episode, think someone else will too, let them know, share it, get it out there. If you got any topic ideas or any feedback, you can find us on Twitter or writer_syndrome, or you can head over to our website to writersyndrome.com. We got all our other episodes, got some interviews up there. Probably hopefully going to get some more interviews coming in the future.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you have any expectations for us or things you want us to cover or people that you think would be great to interview on here, yeah, just shoot us a line and we'll look into it.
Yeah, we got contact info on our website as well. So yeah, join us for our next episode where what are we getting into next episode?
I think filling your well, emptying your well. I don't know.
Refilling your well?
Refilling your well.
Right? Should it be? I don't know. Something along those lines.
Motivation, inspiration.
Like momentum, you know?
Yeah. Losing momentum and how to get it back.
Because we both just went through this. And
how Russ got her groove back.
That'll be the title. How Russ got his groove. Right. That's enough of that. So until next time, keep writing.